Hello, my name is Kelly Thomas, and I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about accreditation standards and a couple of agencies that I looked at in terms of how they accredit institutions with regard to technology and how they incorporate technology into their standards. And in looking at some of the information that Dr. Flora provided on D2L, I noticed that SACS, with regard to technology, had quite a bit more in their guidelines than MACTE. And I'm more familiar with SACS because I work for a post-secondary educational institution and not as familiar with MACTE. So I wanted to look at both and just do a short comparison with regard to technology and their standards. First of all, I wanted to look at SACS and its overall mission. And the mission itself is to actually enhance educational quality throughout the region and the improvement of effectiveness of the institution by ensuring that they meet certain standards by both the higher education community, and they want to also address the needs of society and students in general. SACS accreditation also ensures that the institution has a mission that is appropriate to higher education, and it has resources and programs and services that are sufficient to accomplish and sustain that mission, that they want the institution to have clearly specified educational objectives, and that these are consistent with the mission of the institution as well as the degree that it offers, and to make sure that these objectives are successful in achieving their goals. Now, again, we're going back to technology in terms of accreditation in these agencies. The first process that I saw where technology was mentioned was in the process of SACS accreditation itself. And SACS is broken into, there are certain guidelines that the institution needs to go through for the process. And there are sections, and one of the sections it has is just the process of a SACS accreditation in general. And it mentions distance education. And it talks about distance education as being a formal educational process in which the majority of instruction in a course occurs when the student and the instructors are not necessarily in the same place. It also talks about the instruction being synchronous or asynchronous. It talks about internet, talks about one- and two-way transmissions and broadcasts, closed circuit cable, just different ways of accomplishing these technological programs. Also, under SACS accreditation requirements, it talks about all educational programs. Underneath that, there's a section 3.412 where it specifically mentions technology. And with regard to looking at these two agencies, this was probably one of two places that I actually saw technology mentioned specifically. And in this particular instance, it talks about the institution's use of technology and that it should enhance student learning and it should be appropriate for meeting the objectives of the program. It also talks about students having access and training to the use of technology. So this is one of the areas that it specifically mentioned technology with regard to SACS. Then SACS accreditation process, it talks about comprehensive standards that the institution must meet. With regard to this, in section 3.7, it talks about faculty effectiveness. It does not mention technology specifically, but it does talk about the institution evaluating their staff and faculty and make sure that they have the proper credentials and that each faculty member is in accord with the published criteria, regardless of whether or not they're on a contract or whether or not they're tenured. It also states that the institution will provide ongoing professional development, which I would hope, if they are actually addressing technology in their programs, that they would address making sure that the faculty would be prepared to be able to teach this different forum. In section 3.8, within the SACS requirements, it does talk about library and other learning resources. Doesn't talk about technology specifically, but it does mention that there are different informational resources which may encompass technology. Talks about the institution providing specific facilities and resources that are appropriate to support the teaching and the mission, and that it ensures that the resources will be timely and that there will be regular instruction about these resources. And it also provides that there will be qualified staff and ample staff in order to teach with regard to these resources. In terms of SACS federal requirements, it does mention, and this is a little bit more stringent, but it talks about distance and correspondence education. It says that there will be documentation of distance education. And Section 4.81 talks about that the student will need to be verified to determine that this is the appropriate student. They do that in terms of different methods that they use. They talk about having a secure login and passcode, and that making sure that the exams are proctored. And then it does mention, here's the other place that it talks about new or other technologies and practices that are effective in verifying the student identification. And this really doesn't have to do with necessarily learning. It's just talking about verifying their identification. But that was the only other place that I saw that technology was actually mentioned in terms of the SACS accreditation process. And then again in 4.82, it talks about having a written procedure in place for actually protecting the privacy of students when they enroll in distance education programs. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about MACTE. Just in looking at their mission, it was founded in 1995, and they're dedicated to improving academic degree and certificate programs. And they primarily look at institutions who are teaching from infant age all the way up to high school level. So they look at infant and toddler and early childhood, which they have certain age criteria to meet each one of these, elementary, and then secondary 1 and 2, which again goes all the way up through age 18. They have 3 levels of accreditation. They have an initial accreditation, they have a full accreditation. The initial accreditation goes for a maximum of 4 years. The full accreditation has a maximum period of 7 years. And then they have an accreditation with stipulation, and that is if they have an institution that is deficient in one of their areas, they can actually go through a process and be given a period of time where they can actually go back and correct that deficiency. And hopefully that they will get back to a full accreditation process. Their accreditation process also has to do with quality. They have 3 quality principles that they define. Quality principle 1 is evidence of candidate learning and making sure that the teacher or the institution supports their teaching principles. Quality principle 2 has to do with faculty learning and inquiry, meaning that they want an institution that is continuously trying to improve their techniques and their institutional effectiveness. And quality principle 3, which has to do with program capacity and making sure that they have sound management principles that are in place. Now, with all that said, here's an overview of what the accreditation process entailed. It is a little bit lengthy, and here's just kind of a timeline that MACTE goes through. But just overall, that's the accreditation process. But looking at technology in terms of MACTE, the only time I saw that mentioned in their process was in Appendix A, when it had to do with collecting actual backup documentation to support their accreditation. And it just happened to mention distance education programs and making sure that the components were included. It does talk about distance education in terms of that it will accredit institutions offering certification course components via distance education. And that's pretty much the only mention with regard to technology. So, in summary, in looking at both of these, SACS obviously has a little bit more with regard to technology in their requirements as opposed to MACTE. Both really don't have a lot of technology involved in their standard process. So I would imagine that probably in the future that there is probably going to be more of this with regard to technology involved in the accreditation process, just simply because it is becoming more and more popular. And I think that agencies really need to look at the institution in terms of offering effective and quality programs. That's about it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to view my video. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.